Very good. Welcome. We are delighted today to have this special presentation at the School of Theology. And the title of our webinar is Empowering for Success, Increasing Participation of Students of Underrepresented Backgrounds in Graduate Education. This Zoom webinar is primarily intended for School of Theology instructional personnel, including staff, faculty, and doctoral PhD students. The panel is meant to address these two questions. What does it mean to be a student of underrepresented background in graduate higher education? And how can faculty create opportunities for them to find their own voices? The topic is related to one of the action items in the School of Theology diversity statement, and I quote, to acknowledge that this is a teaching and learning environment that encourages the participation of all individuals in speaking their minds and sharing their experiences for the purpose of expanding our understanding of one another and the world we live in, end of quote. Our distinguished panelists are Dr. Alana Anderson and Dr. Laura M. Jiménez. Dr. Alana Anderson is Boston University's inaugural Director of Programs within BU Diversity and Inclusion within the Office of the Provost. And Dr. Laura M. Jiménez is Senior Lecturer and Department Chair for Language and Literacy Education and incoming Associate Dean for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the Wheelock School of Education. Now we'll proceed in alphabetical order, and we agree that we will address each other by our first names. So Dr. Anderson, welcome.
Thank you, Rady. I am going to share my screen here. And so thank you everyone for joining. I think that this is a really important conversation to have and to center the needs and sort of experiences of underrepresented graduate students. As I was preparing for this talk, I found a report from the Council of Graduate Schools that really just sort of organizes us around that the trends and the numbers of graduate students of color, of graduate students from underrepresented identities is increasing, right? So, all Latinx, Black, Asian, Native American students, we're seeing increases in their first-time enrollments. And then in addition, we're seeing that first-time enrollees in fall of 2018, a couple of years ago, sort of we're seeing just the numbers and the trends are increasing in terms of participation. And so then when we talk about and sort of we think about, so for folks coming into the academy that are underrepresented in sort of the graduate student role, what does it mean to make space and sort of be in the environment of higher education? And so I listed, I think, these 4 topics that I think are really important and sort of come to rise for me. This notion of diversity versus inclusion. So for me, diversity is really identifying who we are, sort of who's in the room, and the numbers around sort of what is the makeup of our space and our environment. And I think that's really important. And I think we have to, within graduate programs, do a better job of really examining what those numbers are and how those numbers sort of come to make the environment that we have. But that is very different than inclusion. So inclusion speaks to how do different identities thrive? What is their participation? What is their engagement? How do they access opportunities for mentors, for research opportunities, right? And sort of what does it mean to sort of be a student within that environment? And how do some people utilize the mechanisms that are available? And how do others not know that there are mechanisms available to be utilized, right? And I think that those are really important questions that departments and faculty need to be having about the experiences of different types of students. Perception versus reality, for me, talks to the ways and the language that we use to attract graduate students to our program, and then what they get when they show up there, right? So I think that we can be very advanced in our language to attract students into our program, whether it's the faculty that they'll get to work with, the opportunities that will be awarded to them. But then sometimes the reality is, especially for a student from an underrepresented background, it's isolating. There aren't a lot of folks that look like you. There's a lot of shock to being in the environment. Going to the next one, you feel a lot of imposter syndrome, right? You're not really sure why it is you got into this program. You sort of worry that everyone around you is thinking that you can't, that you don't have the credentials, the experience, the expertise to navigate the program. And most of our students do, right? They're very well educated, they're well equipped, but something about sort of the environment connected with this notion of imposter syndrome sort of does something to them to make them think that they shouldn't be in the spaces where they actually should be and where they provide great value to. And then this last piece of this invisible labor, I think sort of also is sort of the sum of all the parts of the other things that I was talking about, in terms of you start to see that the environment maybe wasn't created for you, doesn't really make space for you effectively. And so you, as a graduate student, some graduate students of color from underrepresented backgrounds, sort of take on the labor and the responsibility of starting to examine what would it look like to diversify the space. What are the needs of graduate students of color, and sort of how do those things center? So they take on additional work and additional labor beyond being just a student to sort of talk about, make space for, examine and investigate what more can be done. And that comes at a cost, right? It comes at a cost in your identity. It comes at a cost if you're also having to continuously explain mechanisms or components of your experience that are not positive. And then also met with resistance by an administration or other faculty members. So there's a lot sort of that bubbles up for a student from an underrepresented background in terms of navigating a 2, a 3, a longer year experience within a program, and then sort of coming out on the other end, if successfully sort of completing it, sometimes feeling really depleted and overwhelmed and overworked because the work has been more than just the academic work. So I think when we think about opportunities to support underrepresented graduate students, I think there's a lot that we need to be doing. These are just a small tidbit of sort of what I think, and I know Laura will offer some really great opportunity mechanisms as well and interventions, but finding ways to talk and support that culture shock that I think a lot of students come into the academy with around their own experience, what it means to be at a new institution, what it means to sort of, if they're at an existing institution where they went as an undergrad, sort of traversing now sort of this different interplay as a grad student. Sometimes we don't, the resources that we avail our undergraduate students are very different sometimes than what we avail our graduate students. And so that's the culture shock sometimes too, when everything was at my fingertips as an undergrad and now I have no idea where to turn or what to do. So support through cultural organizations or affinity groups, I think, is really important. Thinking about and examining, do you have affinity groups or cultural groups that can support different types of students and different types of identity? Supporting the unseen burdens. One of the things that I've been interested in examining a lot as an example is food insecurity. We have a high population of graduate students, and then you also connect that to graduate students of color that are food insecure. And so the definition of food insecurity is sort of the inability to have the example sort of in definitions is sort of knowing where you're going to get 3 healthy sort of nourishing meals a day. And so folks who don't have access to that or don't know where they're going to get their next meal are labeled food insecure. And that there is a growing population, the literature tells us there's a growing population that are graduate students that are food insecure. And so we've had conversations, I know at BU and at other institutions, about creating food banks and different opportunities to really lean into supporting our food insecure students. But I think that that's another place where I don't know that we're asking questions of our graduate students around their experiences relative to food insecurity and other components of their life outside the classroom, and how do we best support them. And then I think there's this interesting piece of what we do when students do find a voice and when they do sort of utilize their voice to to share what's happening and really vocalize their experiences. Laura's chuckling because I don't know that we're always prepared and ready for what comes from that, right? We want to sort of advocate and encourage that students have voices and that they sort of find their own advocacy, and then we don't like what they tell us, and then we sort of back off. So I think it's really thinking about the formal, the informal mechanisms for students to share their experiences. And then also, I think what is always telling to a student is what you do when they share something with you that is not positive. Sort of what is the next step, how things are investigated, how are students engaged with when they have issues that are not positive, and also sort of when are we listening and when are we not listening? Are we only listening when we need something from a student or when they seek to serve us in a particular way, versus sort of holistically listening to what the experience is and making necessary and authentic changes to the process of the experience in a way that it makes more space for students to be authentically themselves. I also think it's important to think about whose job it is to sort of support underrepresented graduate students. And I would be of the camp that says it's everybody's job, and so everybody has to take a role. But I think that we know that sometimes it is the job of, you know, folks that look a certain way or identify or sort of come out a certain way with a certain identity, and then we sort of pass students on to them and sort of put the work on them. But I think if we think holistically about this work, we think about training for faculty and staff responsible for recruitment in terms of the language that they're using. I think we think about a commitment to inclusive pedagogy and thinking about what happens when microaggressions, harm, some sort of trauma happens inside the classroom. How equipped are we to handle those experiences and sort of help sort of reconcile them in ways that are supportive and holistic for students? I think it's opportunities, whether it's conferences, workshops, research experiences that are available to all students to access, regardless of socioeconomic background and other mechanisms like that. And then I put this last slide as a departmental audit because I'm interested sort of in thinking about system, policy, practice. We have a lot of rules that are written and we have a lot of rules that are unwritten that make up sort of the experience of moving through the academy for a graduate student. And a lot of times our students from underrepresented backgrounds don't know those unwritten rules. They don't know how to traverse or navigate the department utilizing those unwritten rules or understanding what they are. And nobody talks with them about that. Like they don't have a guide lots of times to sort of manage that. And so sort of thinking about and taking a step back to say, what are our processes? What are our policies with a capital P and our policies with a lowercase p? And how would someone who is not versed in our department, in our area, how would they know those things? And then starting to think about, are those things that we even need to have as policies or practice, right? So sometimes it is leveraging information sharing. Other times it's sort of getting rid of something old and antiquated because it doesn't really serve the purpose that we thought it served initially. So the last thing I'll share is in sort of preparing for this talk, I encourage you all to look at different examples of opportunities for support around graduate students. One I came across that I read more about and sort of really learned about was at the University of Maryland, Baltimore campus. They created the Scholars Program. And really what it did is it's structured around 14 factors that contribute to the program's success. And really it looks at a holistic empirical systems to approach successful recruitment and graduation of African-American doctoral students, right? So it's a specific program for a specific sort of organization of an area of the academy. But those 14 sort of factors are really sort of, I think, the foundational pieces of what you need to be thinking about if you're thinking about how you support underrepresented graduate students. You know, the financial aid, the recruitment. This program specifically starts students in the undergraduate experience and then transitions them into the graduate experience. So there are obviously caveats to the program that wouldn't line up effectively for every graduate program. But when you think about sort of building community, you think about involvement, mentorship, you think about sort of these really holistic ways to connect a student, connect to their student experience, and help them move through the experience such that they are effectively supported and effectively celebrated throughout the process. I think that a program like this can leverage continuous conversation about what are the needs and how do you make those needs effectively known, and then what do you do to continue to shift and change practice such that you're centering the voices and the experiences that you're seeking to recruit that are different than sort of the traditional students or experiences that have been in your program. So that's sort of my thoughts about it. I will end this share and then pass it over to Laura to hear what she has to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alana. Dr. Jiménez, you're welcome.
I don't have any slides, so just right up there. But I do have a fabulous t-shirt. It says ally. It's a noun and a verb, cause a ruckus and pass the mic. All right. And I think that's a lot of what my work is. I am a white presenting, which means I walk into a room with this big white face, right? Sometimes people think I'm like vaguely ethnic, right? But they don't really, you know. So I'm a white presenting Latina, and I'm a lesbian. I don't talk about myself being a practicing lesbian because I got it right the first time and I've stuck to it this whole time. You know, I've got a learning disability, so that's cool. And I've made it through, right, a system of education in the United States that was not built for me, would absolutely rejected me at every turn, is actually designed to exclude me, right? And now I'm in the ivory tower and I'm trying to change the ivory tower, right? I think Alana and I, we share a lot of the same kind of philosophies around this. And I think if you take one thing away from what she talked about it, what she's saying is we need to change the system. We do not need to change these students. And that is a very different way of thinking than traditionally college and especially graduate school has thought about education, right? It has traditionally, education has been, and again, I will speak only about the United States because that's my background is the U.S. education system. The U.S. education system, K through whatever, right, has been designed to enculturate whiteness into everybody, right? So when people used to talk about a melting pot, it's not a melting pot. We don't want a melting pot. What we want is everybody to assimilate to a very strict, normalized code. And what that code is, right? Again, Alana mentioned that a lot of these rules and regulations are not, right? These policies are not said out loud. So I'm going to say all of them out loud. Okay, so the normalized, reified, measured norm is white, straight, male, cis, meaning you are born and assigned a biological sex that you then perform, right? So again, I'm a cis woman, okay? Standard English speaking, right? Christian, able, middle class. And let me just say, everybody lies about what the middle class is, okay? Everybody, right? Rich people say they're middle class, okay? But what we used to call, right, merchant class or landowner, right? That is who education is meant to support. And literally education in this country is meant to turn everybody into that, or to support that if you can't be turned into that, right? And so what Alana is saying is like, let's look at this system, let's name things and change those things. So one of the things I do a lot of is I look at the ways that students are expected to code switch. Okay, code switching is considered an attribute of a student. In other words, it's for the student's good to be able to code switch into standard English. And standard English is actually white middle class English, right? And so if we can teach all the Black and brown students, right, to talk like white kids, then we're giving them the keys to the kingdom, right? Imagine what that is for that child. Imagine what that is for that teen or that young adult, or in our cases, imagine what that means for a master's student. It means they have spent their life and their success has been hung on losing their cultured language, on actively rejecting their culture and their language. So what are we expecting people, individuals, to give up to be considered part of our educated community? All right. So if you've never had to code switch, if you identify as white middle class and you've never had to code switch, here's what I want you to do. I want you to write down one fairly used word. So I don't mean like the, okay, but I mean, so y'all are, in the School of Theology, so I'm going to make a huge generalization. So what if you write down on a piece of paper, God, like the word God, okay, and stick it in your pocket, right? Or, the Bible or theology, one word, just one word, write it on a piece of paper, stick it in your pocket. And for an entire day, from the time you wake up until the time you go to sleep, you cannot say that word. You have to think and you have to talk around the word. You have to avoid that word. That will give you some idea what code switching is like, right? It's not exactly the same, but it gives you an idea of what the kind of double consciousness, right? The kind of double consciousness that I'm talking about, that you have to be aware of, right? The society around you and those expectations. You're aware of you and your society, and you have to somehow like balance, and it's always balancing, right, by you losing out and adhering to the rules, often, as Alana said, unspoken rules, right? So that's one of the things. The other thing is, in education, we talk about differentiation, right? But we think, oh, we don't need to do that in graduate school because they know all about school. But what if we differentiated along lines of experience? What if we said Black, brown, and Asian folks have experienced whiteness, right? Because we've had to navigate it. White folks haven't actually had to navigate it or think about it, right? So in one sense, I think we have to differentiate to let white folks catch up with us, right? And we never talk about that. We never talk about the idea that people that are in those privileged classes, people that are not marginalized, really are in a detriment, right? They don't have the kind of education that we have, right? They're not used to cross-cultural reading, cross-cultural speaking, cross-cultural thinking, right? Because you've never been asked to, right? What if you thought about it that way, right? I think the other thing I want to touch on, and again, Alana set me up beautifully for this, is that with first gen master students, they're here often to become a professional of some sort, right? They're here to become like, okay, I don't know, theologian. I don't know what you people do, right? But right over at Wheelock, they're here to become a teacher. They're here to become a counselor. They're here to become, right, to work in, they might be here. A lot of people in Cultivating are also getting social work degrees, right? So they're here to become professionals of some sort. Well, that comes with a steep price tag, right? You've got transportation, right? You've got clothing, right? When you have to go do an internship, right? Listen, I'm sitting here, right? I'm sitting here in a t-shirt and okay, I've got the comfy jeans. I've got the comfy pants. I'm not wearing real pants for you people. I've got like the stretch pants. Okay. But that's because I've got the privilege of having a PhD behind me. I'm not going out to get a job right now. But when you go to get a job, you need like a job interview outfit. You need like a case, right? You got to look that way. A lot of people can't afford to do that. So one of the things we did over at the College of Education is we started saying, okay, so for first gen students, we should have an allowance for them to buy an interview outfit, for them to buy, right, and have available for them clothes that are appropriate to do their internships, right? They may not have transportation. Can we provide, right? If it's can we provide a T card? Can we provide an Uber account? Like we're trying to figure out where those gaps are and how we, right, as the organization, as the system, can help fill those gaps. Instead of saying, well, if they can't get there, that's their problem, right? Again, what we're talking about is changing the system, not changing the student, right? And that's I'm hoping, right, that we can open it up a little bit to questions. So I don't want to take that much time, but I think we are supposed to be learners, right? We are supposed to be learners. We're supposed to want to learn things. But what ends up happening is as you get farther and farther along in, right, academia, your learning becomes so specific. It becomes laser pointed. And so we forget that sometimes we have to learn things that we never thought we would need to. You as faculty need to learn about systematic whiteness. You need to learn about, right, what it means to be toxically heterosexual, right? Men need to learn about the patriarchy and they need to stop supporting it, right? These are things that are learnable things, right? I'm never going to say you're a good person or a bad person because I don't know you, right? I don't know you. I also don't care if you're a good or a bad person. I care if you're going to uphold the ideals of social justice in the classroom. That's what I care about. And I can see that, right? So you can learn how to be a culturally sustaining teacher. That's a learnable content. Y'all need to learn. We all do, right? So, Rady, we got some questions?
We do. Thank you very much, both of you. Just give me a moment. Thank you very much, Laura, and thank you, Alana. And then what I would like to do, actually, we have one question in the chat. I have some questions of my own, and I find it so interesting. There are a couple of things that I wrote down in my notes, and I'm sure that we can develop a kind of conversation around some of these points. And I just would like to talk about, Alana was talking about the invisible labor of students when they come to a graduate school, they do the PhD program or a master level degree. And I found that very interesting in the invisible labor. It made more sense to me thinking about doctoral students because the traditional paradigm is that the student comes to the school to learn from a professor and to learn and acquire mastery of a literature and to be able to formulate original research questions. And that's what the student is expected. But it is an invisible labor when the students start working on other things that are important. And I don't know if you can elaborate more about that, Alana, and also Laura. I would like to hear your opinion about that. I never heard the notion of the invisible labor, but it made a lot of sense to me and my own experience.
Yeah, we a lot of literature that is written about invisible labor tends to censor faculty of color for the same reasons, right? To get these asks around supporting students of color, and being an advocate and a mentor, as well as still doing your work, your research and your committee work, and, sort of traversing the road to tenure if that's what a faculty member wants, right? So we know of, or there's language around it relative to the faculty of color experience, probably also a little bit to the experience of women in the academy in specific areas, right? So, in some ways it's like the role of the oppressed to fix the oppression. It is sort of how it's set up. And I think that extends out to graduate students as well. And I think what's also interesting sometimes in the grad student experience is the ask may come from someone that you respect, or the ask may come from the department. So then there's this also power dynamic and power differential of wanting to pay it forward to the program, wanting to help out the faculty member that's asked you, or make that connection. But essentially, we have to think about sort of then who is doing the work of helping diversify the program, right? If it's that, we're tapping specific students to talk to potentially to new incoming prospective graduate students consistently, if we're asking X student to always sit on a panel at X thing, right? Like that's work, right? And it's the work of sometimes always talking about your trauma as a person, a not white person, underrepresented background person, right? It's speaking to sometimes the trauma and the hard parts of sort of existing in a space that is white or privileged in a specific way that you don't identify with. But it's also, I think I challenge people to think about that it's also being tapped for one aspect of your identity that speaks to one component of who you are, and not the full sort of understanding of who you are as a person. And I think that gets lost as well, right? If people only tap me because I'm Black to do things that sort of help better getting more Black students, they lose the ability to understand the other multifaceted ways that I am a person and that I exist in this world. And you're also sort of telling a story of what your currency is. And I think that's also a piece that has to be sort of reconciled in sometimes how we do the work, that labor and sort of the cost of that labor.
Very good. And Laura, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, there are times I have actively discouraged students, especially students of color, right? By Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC students. I have actively discouraged them from starting a new club or association, or starting, right, or agreeing to be on a panel or whatever. And I have actively discouraged students from doing that because I worry that they are re-traumatizing themselves. I worry that they're taking that effort and energy away from their studies, right, in order to educate, right, the system. So I'm all for folks who choose to do it, right? And then I want to find ways of compensating them for that, right? So again, I will ask, over at the Wheelock, we're having some issues, some faculty are having some issues with pronouns, right? It's just a thing, right? And there's a few faculty that are unable to, which I don't believe, which is why I put the scare quotes, right? Unable to change the use of a binary he and or she to using the singular they. We are smart, flexible people. I guarantee you, if I say you can't park there, but you have to park over there, you'll be able to figure it out. So I am not going to ask our students, right, who are, right, gender non-binary or trans, I'm not asking our students to come and talk to our faculty. That is putting them, I believe that is putting them in a vulnerable situation. Instead, I am contracting with an organization through Fenway Health that will have people that, and we are compensating them, right? Again, I'm going to compensate them for their time to come because they have signed up for it. They have been trained to do this work. This is what they have decided to do with some of their time. And I have the ability to compensate them, right? See, there's the difference. I want my faculty to learn this, but I don't want them to learn it on the backs of our students.
That is such an important point, and it's interesting because Alana, when she was talking about and elaborating on this question of invisible labor, she also made the correlation between the experience of faculty of color who do this invisible labor and the students of color or underrepresented backgrounds who do this invisible labor. And now, Laura, you come to the end of your comment to one important issue is that related to faculty, that often faculty of underrepresented backgrounds are asked to address these issues as part of what they do and as part of their tasks. So there's a correlation here, but I do want to keep the focus on graduate students of underrepresented backgrounds. Now, we have some comments, and I think we have two open questions. And one question in the chat that appeared first. I'm going to read this one by Professor Luis Menendez Antuña. Luis says, both panelists have alluded to that, but I wonder if they have more thoughts about it. On the one hand, faculty programs want to be as equitable as possible. On the other hand, we are preparing students for a system that is not equitable. What does it mean to be a fair educator, mentor in the midst of this conundrum? Thank you very much, Luis. And Alana or Laura, anyone who would like to address this?
Yeah, I think I'd like to examine fair and what does fair mean, sort of fairness a little bit. So that would sort of be my question to the question. But I don't believe that the classroom or the graduate experience should ever be designed to mimic the what's happening in the world. I actually believe that the graduate experience is a space to push the boundaries of creativity and understanding and to sort of dream out, you know, where spaces can be better equitable and where we can serve communities better, right? Like, I think that the practice and the exercise of imagination that is allowed in a graduate experience, I think provides that you are learning the constructs that have created a lot of the issues that we're dealing with. But you have the space and the imagination and the engagement and the opportunity to challenge those constructs in the classroom and talk about what a more equitable, just world would look like. So I think that to name inequity is important, but I would hope that faculty can find places and spaces in their curriculum and their content to engage in learning about what's the possibilities beyond the constructs of white supremacy and racism that are specific to our world. I think the other piece, if we are being equitable practitioners and researchers and teachers, is to provide that we understand that the world is hard for certain students in underrepresented backgrounds, and we create space and mentorship and support for that, right? Like, the world is going to be hard enough. So, you know, I see the work in academia sometimes as being a space where a student can authentically be who they want to be. You know, I am a higher education practitioner, and I sort of am grounded in the fundamentals of student development theory, which is, you know, building sort of the students getting to be their whole selves and sort of understanding the different developmental patterns of students and sort of where they are, and this idea that you meet students where they are, but you also make space for them to authentically be who they want to be. And so I think that that's a piece of the work, in addition to the education and the learning is to allow students to be where they are, allow them to change and grow and examine their identities. And I think we think about that in the undergraduate experience, but I think it's still happening in the graduate experience. And so to make space and support for that, I think is really important.
I want to absolutely, I'm gonna say yes, yes, and I want to say, I think the idea that somebody comes to the graduate program and they don't know that the world is not fair, right? If you are a marginalized person, you're aware. Okay, we are a whole lot of aware. You know, it's not going to be a surprise to us. But what we need as graduate students is we need somebody to name, as Alana said, to name, right? And to give us access to what those underlying systems are, right? And then we can decide what we want to do with that information. Do we want to play the game? Do we want to be white adjacent? Do we want to try to buy into this nonsense? Fine, right? You've given us those tools, right? If on the other hand, we want to disrupt, then you've given me the tools and the power and the self-advocacy that I need to be able to go in and do that work, right? Those are very different, right? The other thing is I think we need to be very careful about, you know, we talk a lot about self-care, right? And then, but on the other hand, like in education, we talk a lot about grit. Do y'all talk about grit at all, Rady? No? Okay, so in education, we talk about grit a lot, right? And about how, well, students just need to persevere through problems, you know, BS. Here's what we need to do. We need to, again, differentiate. Students of color, right? Black, Indigenous, people of color need to learn self-care practices because we're not good at it. Not good at it, right? If we've survived and have succeeded in education, we have done so by really not taking care of ourselves, right? The folks who need grit and perseverance are the folks that have the most power because you have the most to learn and unlearn. So grit to the people that have the most, right? The most power in the system. Self-care for those that have had trauma and require, they need to be able to learn how to step away, and take care of themselves, and then be able to come back in, right? So those are two different things.
I will keep thinking about this notion of differentiation, Laura. Really very helpful. We also have a question, comment by Professor Nicolette Mangolos Weber. I will read it. I have been increasingly aware of the strains many students are facing acquiring very basic needs like housing, food, clothing, transportation, etc. The idea of food insecurity graduate students is such a travesty. I love the idea of a professional clothing allowance. I am interested to hear more ideas to share resources and build new systems of support in these areas for our students. That's the comment from Professor Nicolette Manglos Weber. Anyone, Laura or Alana?
I will say, I don't think the university has this as part of their mission or as part of their strategic plan. I think this is going to be a college and school by college and school, right? And so you've got to figure out what your students need, and then you have to figure out how to put some of your dollars into fulfilling that need. We figured out what our first gen students needed, and then we've been working for the last couple of years to try to fulfill that, right? Again, so that's some work. So that's some homework y'all need to do, is to figure out, talk to your students. What do you need? What are they? What is it? Something common, not to an individual, but that you see over and over and over again. And then figure out how you can put some of the monies that go to your college into those spaces.
Yeah, I think Laura's right. And the only thing I'd add is sort of to the specificity of, you know, at one school, it could be access to a specific conference. At another school, it could be editing because there's a particular paper or something, right? So I think it's going to be unique to the school or the college, and sort of also to whatever the process is by which sort of a student goes through whatever, however many years. But the other piece of that I think Laura is getting at too is ask your students, sort of like talk to them about sort of where are the high needs or the places that provide stress in the program relative to X thing or Y thing. And I think that they'll tell you where that support should go.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I want to go back to this issue of invisible labor somehow relates to this point. There may be students who don't want to talk about, they may feel embarrassed or they may feel shame and they don't want to talk about needing food or needing money to buy clothes, to go to for a job interview or an internship. And I wonder, and I have an answer for this, whether this is part of the cultural change that must take place so that students don't feel embarrassed or ashamed of that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that someone put in the chat, like asking anonymously, and I think that that's an easy way. I think that, these are issues that have to be examined and accessed from multiple vantages, right? So if you have mentorship or support from like a faculty advisor and they're asking questions and they're interrogating and examining a student experience such that it goes beyond just what's inside the classroom, that's one way. And then if you're regularly and sort of holistically surveying or outreaching to your students to get information and maybe, making it anonymous, confidential, sort of like whatever the language is, that's another way. And then, is there an organizing student group or several student groups that sort of come together and then have an opportunity to share back to your college administration sort of what's the pulse of that specific experience or identity. That's another way, right? So I think the other piece of what you have to take away is that this is like work, and it's like consistent work. You can't just like check a box and say like, oh, I got it, we did it for this year, pat yourself on the back. Like, you have to be in the practice of doing this. It has to be really organized into your way as a college, your way as a faculty member, because it has to be consistent. Because the other piece, I think, for particularly BIPOC students, they're looking for consistency. They're looking for someone who is consistently showing up and caring and connecting. I think there was a question about sort of mentorship, or there was a comment too of, yes, it's true that there are less faculty of color in the academy, so there are less opportunities maybe to find a mentor that looks exactly like you. But are there opportunities to find an advocate and a resource in your faculty department that you can talk to about issues, that you can present concerns with, right? And how do faculty members sort of organize their language and their understanding in ways to be effective resources, rather than, I think sometimes what I see is we just reinvent sort of the system, in that it's like, well, this is how it was done, this is how you have to go. Sort of to Laura's point, it's sort of grit, but in the academic language of like, everybody had to deal with that in that way. So you're just sort of on the path of dealing with the same things we all did, rather than examining that maybe this is a problematic experience and we should interrupt it such that others don't have to experience it. So I think it's constant work.
Yeah, I find this very stimulating. Again, on that point, in my own experience, I remember that at one point I was feeling, well, this is exactly what I had to deal with. And at one different point, I realized, but it doesn't mean that it needs to continue. And I think that sometimes professors, we have a difficult time in making that transition. Like the extra work that I had to do during my doctoral students, and I feel that it's expected, it's part of the system, is part of what it means to get a doctoral degree. And then there must be another moment in which you start saying, well, is that the case? Is it actually necessary? or are we inflicting injury in our students? So that's really fascinating. Now, and you, Alana, addressed part of the comment of Dr. Charlene Swill, who posted on the chat, we need to recognize, I quote, the proportional differences why students have so many more faculty to go to for mentorship than students of color. And you were addressing that point, Alana. Now, Professor Shelley Rambo also posted in the chat, I quote, several doctoral students come to BU School of Theology to work on challenging topics that often touch on their trauma and the trauma of their communities. How can I, as an advisor, support them, knowing that the challenge of research is emotionally weighty? If they are separated from support networks at home, this seems even more challenging. Thank you, Professor Rambo. Any comments on that, Alana or Laura?
So I think, listen, I don't want to say that you can't be a mentor to somebody who doesn't look like you, right? I don't think that's what we're saying. I mean, Alana, check me. Okay, so I've had mentors that were straight white men, straight white, cis, hetero, just, they were all the things. And they were great mentors to me, right? Because they took the time to check their own privilege and to say, okay, you know what? I don't know what this is like. Can you, and they would ask me, and it was a conversation, right? Part of being part of being a really good mentor is to also be humble, to bring humility into your practice. Know what you know and admit what you don't know, right? For Latinos, we have this thing, right? And it's called a testimonial, right? And that's how we claim ground, we claim our expertise, right? This is our history, this is our expertise, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, right? And we say that, we say it out loud, we name the things, right? Don't act as if you know everything, right? You don't have to be the sage on the stage to be a really good mentor. And if they need a community, you can help them find that community, right? You can get on the web, you can get on the phone, you can call somebody, you can say, hey, Alana, I got this, right? I got this Black student. They're really I think they're feeling a little like isolated, right? Do you have some suggestions, right? And, or, call student services, or call, I always want to call it the Freeman Center, and that's not the Thurman Center.
Thurman.
Right? I don't know why I thought Freeman, right? Call the Thurman Center. You can do that legwork for them. And that's being a really good mentor, because you're saying, I see that you have a need that I cannot fulfill because I am not everything, but I'm going to get you. I'm going to get you what you need.
Very good.
Specific, I'll just answer really quickly. I know we're running short on time. So the question, particularly around PhD support, I think sometimes the support and recognition can be a little more space on the timeline, right? So like, I think we get so focused in, and I say that as a recovering PhD student, you're so focused in on a timeline. You're so focused in, I gotta do my research and I gotta code and I gotta do and do and do to get to this outcome that is to defend and to finish and all of this stuff, right? And that is already pressure, and that there's already laden with a lot, emotionally, particularly. Like, I'll speak to my experience as a first gen. I was a first gen. I didn't know what I was doing in some ways, but I had a really amazing advisor who was also flexible with me. So, we had timetables and we had timelines, and those could be shifted. And she was realistic with me about sort of, what does it mean to not make this deadline? What does it mean to make this deadline, right? And so I think it's also sometimes students are looking for the support sometimes to just let the gas off, like let off the gas, and to name that, this work is overwhelming and it's taxing in these ways, and I just need to step back from it for a moment. And I think that's where a good advisor comes in, to sort of give that space without sort of any worry about what comes after in terms of a timeline or how this sets you up in this way that is harmful or whatever, right? So I think sometimes it's just about sort of that support, again, of that whole person, right? This experience, this educational experience is one component, but there's a whole person there. And so as much as you can kind of support that and name that and give space and grace to that, I think is also important to sort of traversing the experience effectively.
And I have 3 comments that I would like to honor before we go. One of them comes from Professor Wesley Wildman, that's on the chat, and I will read it. As an immigrant, I did a lot of code switching. I came from a place where English is spoken, albeit in a different dialect, which made things easier than for some international students. But in the USA, I had to adapt to a new culture with unfamiliar social norms, figure out as a working class person how to function in the upper middle class world of academia, and learn a bunch of new skills such as writing and speaking in specific ways, including carefully regulating my accent. There was a lot of self-editing involved and I wasn't always successful, but I never felt that I was being asked to sacrifice one identity in favor of another. Yet Laura asked us to picture what code switching is like for protected minorities in the USA. And I think she was suggesting that they were being asked to sacrifice one identity for another, and that our educational institutions should not demand that of them. But are not cultural aliens merely adapting, taking on greater flexibility, and learning to function in more than one social setting? We have to work a bit harder, but is that not a strength in the long run? What's wrong with an institutional culture in which some degree of code switching is demanded in this sense? I acknowledge that the situation of underrepresented minorities in the USA might be disanalogous to my situation in important ways. That's the end of this of the comment in the chat. So what do you think? Does code switching means to sacrifice one identity for another? Is that painful? Doesn't that make you a stronger academic? Or in putting another way, isn't there some kind of benefit in that?
Well, okay, so I am not going to take away from Wesley's experience. I don't know what it's like to be an immigrant into the United States. So I'm going to fall back onto the research in the area. Predominantly, when we talk about code switching, we are never talking about, right, the dominant paradigm switching to one of the subordinate linguistic paradigms. In other words, we're not talking about white folks, in order to survive, learning AAV, African American vernacular, or learning Appalachian English, or learning Haitian Creole Pidgin, right? So in other words, we're never talking about that. That when that happens, that's usually in order to just gain, like, that's cultural appropriation. That's you gain status by taking on ethnic cultures, right? By taking this on. So the problem is the imbalance, the imbalance of cultural of this code switching. It's always the more vulnerable, as Bell Hooks puts it, right? The energy on the margins, the activity on the margins is what is always asked to do the change, right? And that's where it becomes an issue of equity and social justice. If it was everybody had to learn something, or everybody had the same amount to learn, I'd be like, that's fine, I get it, right? We all have to learn nomenclature to the field, right? I can spit out, heuristics and, right? And, you know, and all kinds of other, you know, academic, you know, educational academic speak. I'm talking about the fact that when I'm in a group of, you know, predominantly white folks, I know that cussing is going to be frowned upon. Even though when I'm with a bunch of Mexicans, we have the worst language in the world, right? I know when I'm with white people pre-COVID, I shouldn't like touch them or hit them, right? When I'm with my Latino people, we're touching, we're smacking, we're like flipping, we're flicking each other constantly, right? Especially Mexicans, right? So it's who's being asked to change. It is always the folks on the margins. And when I say on the margins, I want to be really, really clear. It's probably by 2022, maybe 2026, that we will no longer be a, you know, a white dominant society. We will probably be, there will be no dominant, there will be we will be a majority minority society. And that's like coming around the bend if we aren't already, right? And I think we probably are. There's a, you know, a number of states, 20, 25 or so, that are already, right? And so, but why are we still being asked to fulfill this one language as the language? That's the issue to me. And again, I'm not an immigrant. I'm from East LA, a little bit different.
Very good. Thank you, Laura. And I have one last comment that is on the chat. It comes from Dr. Anastasia Kidd. I quote, "Do you have any best practices for an institution to hold its white and or white supremacist students accountable for their own learning and development? How do we manage their insensitive or destructive behaviors within and beyond the classroom, especially when they lean on the construct of free speech as their reasoning for not developing their cross-cultural wisdom?" Very good question. Thank you, Anastasia.
You know, I think that the opportunities to infuse equity and inclusion into your curriculum are going to be the places where I would provide that would be most beneficial. So I think in sort of, again, that audit that you're doing, where are you providing curricula that every student in the program is accessing, right? It's, you know, it's not an elective, but it's sort of, you know, foundational to the curricula of the program that provides space and understanding around equity and inclusion. And then I think it's also about sort of the, and how do those things also, how do those courses line up with the mission, the vision, the values of the college or the department? So I think that as much as you can sort of put your espoused values to be your lived values in your curricula, which is your living, breathing sort of component of why you do what you do as a college or a school, I think that that's most helpful. You know, to the part of the question around sort of how do you, I think that the way that in your syllabus and in your pedagogy, you think about and center anti-racist practices and sort of organize a class space that commits to be anti-racist, I think is what I would encourage you to do. So, and sort of to lean into, for folks who haven't done it, lean into examining more, what does anti-racist pedagogy look like? What does inclusive pedagogy look like? And really building out practice in that. So I think Laura can answer better.
Good. And Laura just posted in the chat some links to 2 books. And could you say more about these books, Laura?
I happen to have this right here. Isn't that cool? And so, yeah, listen, my specialty is children's literature, so I always have books. But this to me is probably one of the best collections, Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies by Paris and Aline. I put the TC Press link in there. I would really say if you want to do a study, like a faculty study group, this is a great text to use that with. I would also encourage you to buy it directly from TC Press or from an independent bookstore, because Bezos doesn't need more of your money. The other one is, and I don't happen to have it on my desk, is Goldie Muhammad's Cultivating Genius. Now, this is primarily for like a high school, like secondary education, but I found that she has this book and it's split up into 2 ways. One gives you a really solid understanding of the inequity of education in America. And she does a fabulous historical look at education in America. And then the second half is her framework. And then I think it's very applicable. There are pieces of it that are incredibly applicable to the college classroom. So those are the 2 pieces that I would recommend y'all read, learn, love.
Very well. Alana and Laura, thank you very much for your time, for your wisdom, for your expertise. The amount of questions and the quality of comments bear witness to how stimulating were both of your presentations. So thank you very much. And on behalf of the School of Theology, the faculty, staff, and students, we really appreciate who you are and your work. And thank you for those of you who joined us today. Have a great day. Take care. Be well.
Thank you.